Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks to the organizers for setting up such a super nice conference with a really, really intriguing topic. And also, I've been very impressed by all the talks that were before my talk. And I feel that I'm taking a little different route to this topic. But yeah, I think this is not a problem. And it actually even makes me more motivated to find common grounds for future perspectives, projects and ideas. So anyways, this conference topic itself is quite closely linked to what I've been dedicated to in the last years. And it also actually even goes back to my original and personal motivation for my research topic. I studied literature and music together with psychology later on, and I've been always fascinated by the time around 1900 in Europe. And when several forms of art started to go beyond traditional forms established in the centuries before. For my master degree, I specialized then in musicology and particularly studied new music. Or more generally, another term for it is Western art music from the 20th and 21st century. My driving motivation there was that I felt in the context of an aesthetic experience with new music. So this experience can engender something truly unique, fascinating, something very special somehow. And when I listen to new music or to specific pieces of new music, I experienced it as something that is somehow fragile, somehow filled with a lot of tension. And finally, it evoked somehow an interested attitude, curiosity, and somehow attention in me. And all these characteristics I found quite difficult to grasp and to understand, so that I saw myself generating a very comprehensive research question for my PhD. In this context, on the one hand, I wanted to understand what an experience with new music carries, and therefore, and the theory of predictive coding was then a fruitful approach to this. In fact, then I really became quite fascinated by the experiential consequences that stem from the lack of predictability or high uncertainty in this music. And this culminated basically then in the research, in the question about how pleasurable experiences can be generated in the context of unpredictability and high uncertainty. Like, can this be enjoyed at all? And if so, how does an enjoyment look like? So let's have a brief look at the origins of new music, because some of you, or maybe many of you, are not familiar with this musical style, because it's definitely a niche style. The starting point can be dated back to the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, composers started to distance themselves from the Western tonal system that was established in the 17th century. And this is based on the major-minor tonal scale. We heard already about like the structure of tonal music in the talks before, which is a super nice background for me here. This scale was used for a large part of Western music of the common practice period in Europe, and it is also referred to as classic romantic music. Also in other art domains, for instance, in the fine arts and literature, aesthetic premises and techniques were similarly challenged and reinvented. In painting, Impressionism and Expressionism can be seen as the beginning of a move away from realism, which culminated then in the emergence of Cubism, comprising a language in which abstract forms predominate. In music, around 1907, Arnold Schönberg initiated then the radical paradigm shift by composing according to what he called the free atonality. And later, at around 1920, he had developed his well-known 12-tone technique, in which predetermined rows were the basis for the composition. One of such rows you can see on the slide. Most importantly, the goal of this technique was to completely suspend the tonal hierarchy and to generate music in which no such tonal relationships are present anymore. Rather, like each tone within one octave should be treated equally, should be played equally often. So the second half of the 20th century witnessed a rapid increase of plurality of musical genres and forms, while preserving the aesthetic premises that were initiated by Schoenberg and his followers. Most importantly, the avoidance of a tonal hierarchical structure. Listeners nowadays are confronted with a large variety of musical genres and simply highly differentiated individualistic music. So even for experts and insiders, it's quite hard to allocate a piece to a specific genre, for instance, if one can speak about genres anymore at all. In fact, it is much more the case that each composer develops his her own compositional language and has a personal style. So new music is deeply connected to aesthetic premises such as novelty, innovation, and experiment. Already Adorno argues that new music is inherently tied to a teleological drive for innovation, which might stem from Schoenberg's thinking that a composer, so the creator of the artwork, should always be critical towards the past and should also motivate the listener to overcome old listening habits. Creating and presenting something truly novel is, in the context of new music composition, still like very essential. So before proceeding, I want to make an important note needs to be made. So when I refer to new music in the context of my research, I most of the time refer then to those pieces that are particularly challenging for a listener. One exemplary style of this would be serial music. On the slide, you can see one piece of early serial music. And already, from the score, you might get the impression how this musical material is treated. But since it's a very short piece, about 60 seconds, I think, let's briefly listen to it. That's it. Great. So the proposal I want to make today is that new music, as well as modern and contemporary art in the visual domain, are particularly fruitful styles for exploring the role of predictive processes in the context of an aesthetic experience. To this end, I'll address two major questions today. First, I attempt to characterize the aesthetic state that may be induced and afforded by new music. And second, I try to answer the question how musical pleasure arises in the context of new music, thereby trying to characterize hedonic values that accompany the style or this experience of the style. So these two questions were roughly also the questions that guided my PhD projects, which is why I will now continue with reporting some of the results of the qualitative approach of my PhD, namely an interview study. So of course, on the one hand, this qualitative approach was motivated by my question, but on the other hand, it also seemed necessary to start with it because there's not much empirical research out there about the perception of atonal new music. This is why I decided to conduct an interview study to, just to get a first and fresh idea of what an experience with new music is like, what it affords, and what is also unique about it. Therefore, I interviewed experts in the field of new music, or the term I used in the study was contemporary classical music, short form CCM, as well as experts from the field of classical music. And the idea was to talk to individuals with a long-term experience with regard to one of the two musical styles. So I wanted to make sure that they had, that they have long experience and that they have a regular engagement with this music and that they also were able to talk about it, to reflect upon it. In total, I talked to 16 experts, 8 for each musical style, and each group was interviewed about their musical style of expertise only. The majority of questions for the interview were deduced from a model of music listening and addressed questions in the areas of physiological, affective, and cognitive dimensions. The audio recordings were all transcribed, and the written text was then qualitatively analyzed, and results were compared between groups consequently. In today's context, I'd like to give some insights into certain findings that might be relevant to the topic in question, namely for reflecting upon dimensions of predictions and their relevance in aesthetic experiences. The full report can hopefully be found soon in our paper, which is currently under review. So in the first part of the interview, I asked participants what they expect from a listening experience with music, and generally what motivates them to listen to their style to their preferred style. One clear answer to this was by one participant. And then, of course, you always have the expectation of something unexpected happening. In fact, their motivation seems to be driven by the desire to experience something novel, something unfamiliar. And this might actually originate in the fact that they reported that they wanted to be captivated by the music. Furthermore, they also reported that they want to be cognitively challenged by the music. What I also think is very important is that the piece should give me something that I can continue to think about even after it's over. The captivation factor in the CCM group, sorry, I skipped something. In contrast, in the other group, so in the classical music group, listeners reported more, they seek for other qualities of an engagement with the music. They expressed that they like to be emotionally moved and that they seek for introspection rather than for an excitement. This captivation factor in the CCM group was clearly represented by the answers that participants gave also with respect to their physiological reactions and emotional responses. The analyses revealed that they experience physiological tension, agitation, and they even reported fright, of course, among other statements they made. And the reports about emotional experiences resembled this. Here, participants of the CCM group reported about feelings of repulsion, terror, aggressiveness, and turbulence. Of course, again, you need to see it in the context, but these statements stick out in contrast to the classical music group. Moving on to aspects of pleasure and beauty. I simply wanted to know how experts describe their positive experiences with new music. I asked what they find beautiful in the music and also what they enjoy in it, like how pleasure arises in this context. The answers could be grouped into different main themes. Many statements that they made were grouped into the main theme, music structure aspects. So addressing the structure of the music, or more precisely, the musical material to which they attributed their positive experiences. One attribute of the music they mentioned was coherence and consistency. And I'm talking about the CCM group, so about the new music experts. They described that the pleasurable moments emerge whenever they perceive such a coherence, meaning when a tone or timbre is being repeated across a piece of music. Talking about this issue, one participant said, "It's a kind of guide, a point of reference that guides you through a work." Another participant alluded to the notion of a specific degree of monotony that is positively experienced, since it can lead to a particular continuity. On the other hand, the respondents of the classical music group similarly indicated that the enjoyment of music is linked to a clear structure by referring to recognizable principles, such as well-orderedness and cadence, and the cadence structure of the music. So one participant said here, "What I like about classic music is that it is structured according to recognizable principles." However, while the CM experts, so the classical music experts, contextualize this as a reason for why they like this musical style in general, the CCM group express it more in a conditional way, stating that if a specific piece contains coherence or provides a guide for listening, it engenders a positive experience. The second aspect that was often reported and that was grouped into the main theme of subject-related aspects was that of exploration, meaning the path to this coherence that was just mentioned. Exploration, together with the reported process of transformation, seemed to reflect an essential dimension of the musical pleasure. Participants reported that they enjoyed the active exploration of a piece of music. The real pleasure in listening comes from always having new ways of engaging with a work, for probing it through listening. Furthermore, also respondents report about changes in perceptual processes, relating mainly to an adjustment of perception. One participant said, somehow this idea of beauty involves sharpening your perception, refining it, or in any case, readjusting it. They report that, somehow tiny nuances suddenly can become more conscious. And another notion was expressed by a statement related to consciousness. Not only can the music provoke an experience of heightened awareness, but it is furthermore capable to evoke an expansion of consciousness, a subjective state that was described as strongly positive. So from these excerpts, I want to emphasize, of findings, one can conclude that the reported aspects might be two sides of the same coin. There is a stimulus that does not provide like a very clear pattern, but when hearing that music, we are seeking for such a pattern. And if we find it, we experience pleasure. Of course, when I say we hear, then I of course refer to an interested listener, to someone who has decided to encounter this experience with new music. So of course, again, these findings are just a snapshot from a very comprehensive data set. And for a full report, again, check out the paper if you're interested soon. However, I'd like to give you a brief summary of the findings, somewhat a condensed description of the quality of the aesthetic states that resulted from the qualitative analysis. So so CCM experts expected something surprising to happen in the music, adopted an exploratory attitude, enjoyed the perceptual insight together with a path to this insight, wanted also to be captivated by the music and sought to find an individual access to the piece. Their physiological and emotional state seems to be partly characterized by high arousal dimensions, states that can be actually considered negative or stressful in daily life, but receive positive evaluation in a listening experience with new music. In contrast, the classical music experts expected more familiar events focused on details of the interpretation. Many times they said that like interpretation was key in the reports from them. They enjoyed harmony and rhythm and sought for introspection when listening to classic romantic music, and their physiological and emotional state was characterized by low arousal and a rich, more positive emotional states. So let's move on to the third part of my talk, for which I have 10 minutes left, if I'm right. In which I want to address some theoretical implication of these findings. I have to say that I was extremely surprised how clearly this exploratory attitude was articulated by many CCM participants, at least for the group that I interviewed. You're referring to the limitation of a qualitative research. So at least for this group, an engagement with new music means to be in a state of exploration. And one participant even stated, really the point is to be an explorer, finding your way through a jungle in unmapped territory. One gets even the impression that with enjoying this exploration, they might enjoy being aware of making and generating predictions, somehow that they observe how they create models, keyword self-awareness. In order to understand the perceptual perspective of such a state of exploration, it is worth looking into neuroscientific studies that address how the brain responds to uncertainty. So which neural mechanisms are at play in an engagement with such challenging uncertainty? So first of all, exploration can be seen as the contrast to exploitation, in which individuals follow existing behavior with known reward values. But for survival-related reason, it is in fact important for any living individual to explore novel environments so that one learns to deal with uncertainty. Because only then an agent learns how to track potential reward outcomes, even under difficult circumstances. Though an important note is that these mechanisms about uncertainty estimations need to be carefully transferred to certain aesthetic states, as for instance with new music. Like an art context, in this case, for instance, a concert format provides quite a safe space, and there are not many life-threatening issues there. So this uncertainty estimation might merely apply to sensory decoding processes. So what does perceptual uncertainty mean exactly when considering predictive processing? So such high entropy has been associated with high predictive uncertainty in listeners, which has been suggested to be associated with a weak predictive model, or in other terms, the precision of the predictions in highly uncertain environments are simply very imprecise, as recent research suggests. So moving on to the other aspect of exploration, namely the pleasure that emerges out of the recognition of a pattern, which was described as joy of discovery by one participant. Interestingly, these findings are in line with what my co-authors and I have been suggesting in our theoretical article. And important to note that this was published before seeing the results of the interview study. So here we argue that in such uncertain contexts, correct predictions may be more subjectively rewarding than prediction errors, since they signal to the individual that their predictive model is improving. This is also in line, I mean, with not only Berline's theory, but also with what Vincent was nicely showing in the talk earlier. And again, in line with Berline's theory, which would predict that in highly uncertain environments, a decreasing complexity is increasing the hedonic value of a stimulus. To me, this pleasure stemming from the discovery of a pattern strongly reminds me of the aesthetic aha that has been conceptualized in the visual domain. And which refers to a pleasurable moment stemming from the recognition of a certain pattern. This effect seems to originate from the sudden increase of processing fluency, which is, as we know, it has been touched already in the talks before, which is an important factor for contributing to liking. Moreover, such insights or eureka moments are particularly relevant in the context of both exploratory and epistemic behavior, in which the reduction of uncertainty is critical. And finally, such moments of insights are associated with intense feelings and seem to have neurocorrelates in the limbic system. In the context of music, Bratico argues that the pleasure that stems from a structural insight, she calls it, can be called conscious enjoyment. And here she refers to the increase of awareness, which is accompanied by an aha moment. So these moments of insights could also be seen as markers for the increase of a predictive model in the listener, and are therefore strongly interrelated and relevant in this exploratory state in which predictive models are relatively weak. And this leads me to conclude that an aesthetic state in the context of new music could be characterized by an oscillation between two substates, namely states of active exploration and momentary states of insights. These insights into certain auditory gestalt or pattern ultimately lead to such new models. And in this oscillatory pattern, it might be that a listener goes back and forth between exploring the auditory environment and eventually recognizing and finding a pattern. However, this for now could also describe the basic structure of exploration, right? Like very simple and formalistic. It might even be similar to an aesthetic experience with tonal music, or thinking of non-art contexts. For instance, when visiting a new city, we have to explore the area, and by repeated exposure, we slowly get to know the environment. But at some point, we might have exploited the space. So therefore, one might ask, what is the specificity with regard to new music in this in this oscillatory pattern? I propose that in the case of new music, this oscillation is taken to a next level. So in comparison to music, that is composed according to Western tonal rules. For example, this might become clear. This music provides something like what I call a baseline predictive model, somehow an underlying predictive model which is represented by statistical regularities. As research has shown, those are unconsciously predicted by Western listeners and thereby provide something like a perceptual framework. On top of this baseline model, so to say, composers play with our expectations, and especially musical expectations that underlie Western tonal music have been subject of a huge amount of research in the last 2 decades. Recently, these processes have been explicitly formulated under the framework of predictive coding. And the authors write, it appears that we appreciate the epistemic offering of music, in particular when it is provided in an aesthetically pleasing flux of predictable unpredictability or entropy. But in the case of new music, an important baseline is missing. There is no underlying tonal hierarchy. Oftentimes, no metrical regularity is present, among other properties of the music that are also treated highly freely in the context of new music composition. So from this follows that predictive models strongly have to rely on basic Gestalt formation principles, such as pitch and temporal proximity, or the similarity of sound. And by this, they will be dependent on processes in auditory, sensory, or echoic memory. One consequence I'm inferring from this is that whenever a model is being built, it can likely happen that this is only valid for a brief moment for a certain phrase of the piece. I assume that therefore only somewhat like momentary predictive models can be built. And if the music is coming up as something completely novel, which is something that new music pieces are typical for, the listener has to generate new predictive models. Ultimately, such models might be as varied as the music itself. I like to point out that these considerations are a sketch, a draft of something that I really would like to further develop. Especially, I like to incorporate the findings of our brain imaging study that investigates predictive processes in tonal and atonal music. So the current state of this theoretical account is more a glimpse into my current thoughts. So I'm moving on to my last slide. I think that what I have just described, that is this low level and basic model building task, is the challenging and also somehow the unattractive part of contemporary music. Engaging with the music can simply be like a lot of work, so to say. It can be a mere pattern seeking task. But exactly here, I think one essential component of an aesthetic experience may be found. Being a form of art, such a model building task can be taken on, whereas an agent in a more utilitarian or non-art context would withdraw from such a task. The high uncertainty, the complicated and highly fluctuating model building task, especially in the musical domain, might only be taken on when it is presented in an aesthetic context. And thereby, and this frame could allow listeners to tolerate and even appreciate uncertainty or disorder. Thereby, having made the decision to engage with such high uncertainty, one can encounter novel experiential worlds that one have not seen or felt without the existence of such an art frame. Therefore, I propose that modern and contemporary art, including new music, are particularly fruitful styles for exploring the role that predictive processing plays in the context of an aesthetic experience. This is something that has kept me fascinated, namely, the power of art or the power of an art frame. However, all this clearly requires much more thought, and I'm more than curious what you think about. Thanks very much for your attention.